Welcome back to Tending to Talks. Today, I have the privilege and the pleasure to host Sangeeta Bagga-Gupta, who has held a professor chair at the Department of Education, Gender Studies and Rehabilitation Center at Örebro University since 2007, and since 2016 at Jönköping University, both of which are in Sweden. She is also a visiting professor at universities and cultural institutions in Sweden, Italy, and India. Sangeeta has recently accepted a new visiting professorship at the Maulana Azad National Urdu University in Hyderabad and will be simultaneously affiliated senior scholar at the French National Center for National Research in Paris. Sangeeta's research focuses on communication, identity, culture, and learning from ethnographically framed, multi-scalar, sociocultural, and decolonial framings. Her PhD is in the multidisciplinary area of communication studies, and her postdoctoral studies are in the area of deaf studies. Sangeeta has established and been the scientific head of the Research Environment, Communication, Culture and Diversity, CCD, for 25 years up until 2023. She also established the Research Environment LPS, Learning Practices Inside and Outside Schools, of which she was the leader between 2018 until 2022. Currently, she is editing the large-scale Palgrave Handbook of Decolonizing the Educational and Language Sciences, which will be completed this summer. Thank you so much for finding the time for this conversation. Our talk today will center or will oscillate around concepts of decoloniality and languaging. And given your varied roles in academia as a researcher, activist/entrepreneur, educator, and with so much of your work being rooted in practical engagement, I anticipate we will inevitably at some point navigate away from these concepts and towards their broader context. But to begin, however, I'm interested in the reasons behind your academic choices, singular and plural, and why does decoloniality, language, and identity need to be studied together, or why have you decided to study them together?
Firstly, thank you, Anna, for having me in your series. I can jump in by saying that it is not something that I have done consciously to bring them together. In my own trajectory as a scholar, I have worked with issues of communication broadly, in my bachelor's, my 2 master's theses. And then as a young doctoral student, I remember in my interview or my pre-interview conversation with my going to be future academic supervisor, he could see that I was working with communication. I could not. I had been working with human development, child development, issues of what gets glossed as literacy, people's ways of communication. But I could not at that point see it. Another issue, and I was doing my PhD in Linköping University in Sweden. Another issue I remember during my studies was a comment made by another senior scholar to one of my papers, where she interrogated my use of the word development and pointed to the hegemonic ways. Now, I mean, I'm putting words into her mouth, but the sense that I took from that was that development, the concept and how it is used, needs to be rethought. And this was way before I was working with issues of decoloniality or post-colonialism or anti-colonialism. But having moved across geopolitical spaces, I have studied in different parts of the nation state of India, in the UK, and then in Sweden, and then did my postdoc in the US. Just this movement, this mobility, of course, with digitalization, we have that mobility at our fingertips all the time now. But during the 70s, 80s, and the 90s, when I was doing this back and forth and doing field work as a doctoral student in a northern territory, but doing fieldwork in southern territories, this made me it became very tangible for me that there are ways in which we are talking about human identity. I became cognizant of my own embodied identifications across spaces. A simple thing like being a postdoc at a world-renowned university in the US, I was being interviewed, and this is in 2000, so it's almost a quarter of a century ago. I was being interviewed by a journal in Washington, D.C., where the university is, and suddenly the journalist turns around and says, "Are you a Swedish citizen?" Okay, and I was one, and I still am one. Why did that question come up? Of course, this embodiment is something very important. So issues of decoloniality became very important for me. So even though I was doing my postdoc in deaf studies, whereas my PhD was not looking at all in deaf studies, I just happen to know Swedish Sign Language is one of my primary languages I use on a day-to-day basis. It's fascinating to see how you get positioned. In gender studies, we are more focused on understanding how women and men and other genders are positioned. If we look at other areas of scholarship, disability studies, then functionality becomes the point of departure for our gazing. If we look at ethnicity and migration studies, then there are yet another positionalities that become the center of focus. But if you and I pause for a minute and look at ourselves and our own humanhood, then we see that these are just constructs. We don't need to be scholars to recognize that each one of us embodies a number of different positionalities that we sometimes can understand as shifting in and out of, and in other times as being intersectional, a concept that emerges in gender studies, but that needs to be interrogated because it is so Eurocentric today. So if I have kind of touched upon why decoloniality, and we can go into that very concept a little more, and identity. So why language? Because that is the only tool that we have to be able to frame what we mean by things, to be able to talk about our own experiences, to be able to work as academics. That is the only tool. So without language, we cannot be human. And language, not in its narrow sense of something I am saying with my mouth or I am signing with my hands. Silence is also language. That is a very central part of decoloniality. The silencing of people's voices, people's gaze, people's ways of understanding life.
Just for the greater clarity of our listeners, but also mine, what is the distinction between colonialism and coloniality?
Oh, this is a very, very important distinction. So once we start recognizing that European powers have, for over 500 years, physically taken over different territories on the planet in very different ways. Once we start recognizing, acknowledging that historical fact, we need to go further to understand that it is not just what was done then and the shifts that took place in the last century, particularly, let's say, after the war in Europe that we frame as or label as World War II. It was a European conflict and war that drew on the rest of the world because Europe had, or European powers had colonized other parts of the world. Once we see the shift in political, administrative independence of those territories, we then start seeing a post-colonial era. But what we are recognizing more and more today is that it was not just that political, administrative colonialism, the power equation, but it was also the intellectual hegemonies that European powers managed to, let's call it, export and institute in those territories. It is the intellectual, the epistemological co-opting, the implanting of European ideas of modernity and enlightenment in those spaces that need to be understood as something that is ongoing. And in one sense, that is the fundamental difference between colonialism and coloniality. So it is ongoing. Now, we need to also go further and understand that this is not something that is happening from European territories onto other territories. This is ongoing even within European territories. And you can see that in a number of different ways. In my own engagement with deaf studies, so hearing academics, it is completely legitimate for hearing academics to work within the spheres of deaf education, deaf medical, deaf psychological, deaf sociological issues, without even sharing the knowledge of, let's say, Swedish Sign Language or any other signed language in the world. So that is a coloniality that we are not recognizing. And of course, we have started giving recognition to issues of so-called indigenous populations that we continued to colonize even today. So those are certain aspects of how we can differentiate between this ongoing colonialism that scholars call coloniality.
Mm. Right. We already touched a little bit upon Europe, and this is my next question for you. In the reflective essay responding to Sanju Hira's volume, Decolonizing the Mind, published earlier this year, you mentioned that Europe is at odds for several reasons. Would you mind talking a little bit about what these odds are and why do we need to talk about Europe when we talk about decoloniality, global inequality, economic injustices? You have mentioned a little bit about that already.
Firstly, there is a history to that particular article, well, that became an article. So I was approached by the editor-in-chief of Bandung, Journal of the Global South. I had done a double special issue for them in 2022, I think. Yeah, early 2022. And he turned to me and asked me whether I knew someone who could take on the task of writing a review of Sanju Hira's Decolonizing the Mind, a Guide to Decolonial Theory and Practice. And when I had understood that this was a volume that was over 500 pages long, I mean, suddenly I realized that maybe it is time for me to deepen my readings and go. And I hadn't read Sanju Hira before. So I immediately responded and said, I'll do this. And this was my reading last summer. I was working overseas and I took this volume with me and I read it. I felt pretty empowered and very troubled in certain ways. And I started writing this piece in the early autumn. And I'd finished writing, and a review is normally around 3,000 words. And I'd finished writing it, but didn't manage to submit it when 7 October 2023 happened. I realized that I couldn't submit that piece. I realized that what my own reading and studying of this volume had done was to make me aware of my need to decolonize my thinking. I started making notes. So what you read in the first part, I think I start with pre-7th of October. And and I touch upon the Russian-Ukrainian war. And then I go on to reflect on Sweden as another note. And then I go on to post 7th of October. So it is in the first week of October that I am making these notes. So I actually put my notes as a starting point in my reflection. And then this becomes a regular 8,000 word reflection. And I am very grateful to the editor-in-chief to accept this, because that particular journal, like a number of other journals, are taking the plunge into writing otherwise, writing alternatively. We as scholars who are writing in mainstream Eurocentric ways need to kind of step back and make our writings more pluriversal, go beyond regular ways in which we have been schooled into writing. So this is what that particular piece came into being. I was forced to reflect on what we now cannot deny is a genocide. At that particular point in time, there were very few who could use the word genocide. In today's digital age, when we are being fed with real-time images of what is happening, it is amazing that we are not more actively against what is happening. Terms like democracy, equity, they are completely watered down when we sit in the safety of our homes. And some of us may participate in dialogues around dinner tables or with our students or with our neighbors. But because some of us do not have a direct family members or direct friends who are living in those spaces of hell, we are not more engaged. This is the feeling I had in October of last year, that I cannot submit a text unless I attend to my own state of being. And those notes that I make at the start build on my understanding of coloniality, my understanding of how languaging, how our own production of scientific knowledge falls short of engaging with very, very important challenges that humanity faces. So this is not something that is between Israel and the Palestine in the Israeli Gaza territories. This is something that we need to engage with. I can jump from that example to the issue of gender equity. Unless people in power who are gendered in specific ways participate in gender talks and equity talks, we are never going to see a change. And here I mean, unless men are active. Similarly, when we are thinking of issues of equity when it comes to migrants and refugees, unless white-embodied scholars and white-embodied citizens participate in equity talks, we are never going to see a difference. Unless we start looking at whitehood itself, we are never going to see a change. So the issue of who is doing the gazing on whom, there becomes central.
And in regards to what you said about unless we engage, well, unfortunately, so many of those roles are purely representative, right? They are just there to make us feel that something is being done, but the actual dialogue is not taking place. And what we're seeing right now is, well, I would hope a great wake-up call to all of us who thought that we have democracy. But also it seems that the narrative is falling apart. And it's also interesting to see what will happen from here onwards. Either we will see a very big call to embrace decoloniality, or we're going to shift the other way and we're going to curb the freedom of speech, right? Which unfortunately we're already seeing. I'm going to quote here what you wrote in the essay, because I thought it was such an excellent point that I don't hear being made very often. You wrote that the epistemological task lies in asking, how is it possible that the storyline we, that is European and Northern Abaya Yala settler communities, have built up continue to privilege the atrocities of one Holocaust, where an estimated 11 million humans were terminated, and completely or mostly erase the centuries of colonial atrocities wherein hundreds of millions of lives were destroyed, right? So we're not just talking about the groups in Europe who also suffered Holocaust, such as the Roma people or the disabled people. We're also talking about very many Holocausts that took place on this planet before, during, and after the Second World War that are not considered equal to the European Holocaust. And when I read that, I thought it was an excellent point that you don't hear very often. My next question for you is regarding the binaries, right? So the political interventions that are usually orchestrated to make up for the effects of colonialism often take the form, in theory, of evening the chances, right? Operating from the place of binaries, such as North versus South or East versus West, which is actually one that we see in Europe itself. How do you think the concept of binaries highlights the challenges faced by those whose epistemologies are essentially being continually marginalized and who are depicted as requiring intervention and education? What effect do such divisions, do such binaries have?
I think you make a very, very important, you make a couple of very central issues, both in highlighting what I have written, but in your own words. So, for instance, it's really important not to see Europe as a hegemonic territory. There is an East and a West in Europe, and a North and a South in Europe. So increasingly, we need to see the ongoing coloniality in terms of how Eastern Europe and Southern Europe, European territories are subject to, in addition to the coloniality I spoke of earlier on. Furthermore, there is, if we focus on Europe itself, a point I made earlier is how the privileged co-opt, how the marginalization of certain groups and peoples continues even in Western, Northern European territories. The point that is key here, and this maps onto Southern or Eastern territories on the planet as well, that there is a South in the North and there is a North in the South. And this becomes accentuated also because of digitalization. We need to be able to hold these issues alive. My work is not actually one of the first set of ideas that interrogates binaries. We have a long tradition in a number of different disciplines where binaries have been problematized. What I think is important is, from a decolonial perspective, and the theoretical framework that I am offering allows us to navigate across different established research domains. You've already mentioned gender studies, ethnicity and migration studies, disability studies. These areas never talk to one another. So there itself, we have a dissolving of these binaries. So if you have a migrant who is white, has migrated to Swedish spaces from another part of Europe and sits in a wheelchair and is gay, as scholars, we become And as administrators, despite our strong willingness to be able to support these human beings, equity needs, democratic needs, we become silent because we don't know in which silo to put this human being. So binaries need to be interrogated beyond what we have recognized. In some of my writings, I and my colleagues call this a third position. In a reflective theoretical chapter I wrote maybe 9 years ago, I used the metaphor of Earthrise to show the power of this third position. So it is not a middle way. So it is not, let's say, east and west, and then we have something in the middle. Let's, look at something good from here and something good from that. That's not the idea. So if you think of the two general natural phenomena that we have witnessed, most of us, a sunrise, the norm, most of us have seen that. Some of us maybe are interested in moonrises, a little less known phenomena. But none of us has seen the Earthrise, except those few human beings who have gone into space and have looked back and have seen the Earth go up beyond the moon. We have seen that through representations. But what is required for us to see that? We require a major jump away from the binaries. So Earthrise as a metaphor allows us to kind of taste going beyond binaries. And I think these different domains that I have had the privilege to work in, I have witnessed this hegemonic binary, despite scholars within these domains being very against binary. I remember when I was at, my professor chair was at gender studies in my previous university, I got a major research project from the Swedish Research Council, and I just wrapped that up last year. And the theoretical, methodological innovations in that project were looking at people's participation in Swedish societies, in schools, in post schools, in everyday life, going to the cinema, going to a friend's house, taking the children to a birthday party, going out shopping, going to the healthcare center, having a baby, what people do, what our lives are made up of. So we were actually shadowing human beings above 18, and I think the oldest person was above 50. So we were looking at 40 people. These people had two diagnoses. One group was deaf and the other group had a neuropsychiatric diagnosis. And at my department, at that particular point in time, they said, oh, so what is of relevance for gender in this? This is handicap research. Of course, there was a lot of intersectionality that was coming into how we were looking at these human beings who we were shadowing across 4 years. My point is that despite different academic domains being so cognizant of the problems inherent in binaries, we reproduce them. So a third position, or a decolonial perspective from what I call SWASP, a second wave of Southern perspectives, allows us to do new things, to ask new kind of questions regarding hegemonies of binaries. So we are not white and colored, we are not men and women, we are not A and B, we are both and neither. And these positionalities shift across time. And we know this, again, coming back to a point I made earlier on, we know this when we think of our own life trajectories, when we let go of the mask of objective scientific knowledge. We know this because each one of us is much more than a particular gender, a particular age, a particular, and you have a long list. And those lists are themselves the binaries that we have created. So herein again comes the power of language in showing, in illuminating complexities, which we need to live with.
We desperately need to zoom out and see the air fries. During your time at Örebro University, but also really all the institutions you have ever worked at, but mostly at Örebro University, you served as the director of two significant national research schools, so the Educational Sciences with a focus on didactics, and literacies, multilingualism, and cultural practices. What observations or reflections can you share with us from that period, including any issues you might have noticed during the organization of research and administration of education in higher institutions?
Oh, I will start off from a pessimistic note, and then I hope I will be able to articulate hopeful futures. I was very young when I got my professor chair in open competition. And not having done my PhD in the area of education also made me quite susceptible to both open but also implicit critique. I had the privilege of having university management who nurtured my desire to do alternative science. And for various reasons, I learned very early on to be able to get external funding. So these two research schools, of which I was the director, were learning arenas for my own development as a scholar, transiting from a junior position to a senior position and coming into mainstream, a monodisciplinary area. But I am very firm in my belief that the educational sciences is very, very multidisciplinary and needs to not just have the label multidisciplinary, but also engage, do the multidisciplinarity. So working in the first research school, the Utbildningsvetenskap med inriktning didaktik, the educational sciences with a focus on didactics, I hadn't built that up. I had colleagues who had done that work, and this came with my professor chair package to lead that work. I think we had a record number of applicants. We took in 17 doctoral students. We had university colleges participating. This project made me aware of the hierarchies within the sector where I am very engaged, higher educational institutional sector. I left that when I was awarded research school by the Swedish Research Council, and that was the LIMQ, Literacies, Multilingualisms and Cultural Practices. But I had already become aware that a research school is something that has a whole bunch of problems within its own organization. So the idea was to create what in Linköping are the classical elitist institutions of multidisciplinarity, of which I am a product myself, but to have a monodisciplinary title for doctoral students within research schools then becomes a problem, because it is the leadership of that particular research school that can give fodder to what is possible. Multilingualism was not on the Swedish landscape at that particular point of time. And of the 5 doctoral students we took in, with the focus on musicology, a focus on didactics, a focus on pedagogical work. I mean, so there was a differentiation even within. We tried to have a doctoral student working in the areas of sports science, and I don't think that materialized. But there was, from my point of departure, in the compulsory courses, we had issues of post-coloniality. I brought in philosophy as a point of departure, but I started seeing that my colleagues were very uncomfortable with one another. So as an anthropologist, I got to hear from my ethnographic colleagues, why should we have philosophy? And from my philosophy colleague who I had invited in, I got to hear, but ethnography, studying everyday life, that doesn't actually show anything. So I got to feel as a senior scholar that this is not something that is even possible. It is just an utopia that I have got funding for and possibilities to work with. So this is the pessimistic, and this is something I carry with me. It is very hard for us to break the mainstream, because it is very easy to carry on reproducing, to bring in concepts that are currently fashionable, like multidisciplinarity, like culturally relevant scholarship. But unless we have a decolonial, what I call a mobile gaze, across disciplines, but across also positionalities, who am I to be doing this particular kind of research? I'm not trying to say that everyone can't do all kinds of research. What I'm trying to say is that we need to have that reflexivity as a fundamental part of our research. So we cannot be research educators unless we have this ethos. And this is an ethical issue. This is a moral ethical issue. We use taxpayers' money to just reproduce knowledge and packet it in different ways. So I bring such ideas into SWASP, my offering, my contribution to decoloniality, to try and understand. So if I am very pessimistic about our possibilities, because this is like a big ship that has difficulty in changing its course, and you can't just have one or two people podding, at the hull to move it. You need fundamental shifts in our understandings of what science is. The positive or the hopeful futures lies in the fact that if mainstream hegemonic Eurocentric science, of which is something that is spread across the world, if that has not been able to deliver and engage with the major challenges we see in our world, it's not just the climate, it is the epistemological challenges, it is our inability to engage with the genocide that we see happening. If that has not been able to do it, at least now, all of us, irrespective of whether we call ourselves decolonial scholars or not, we must become curious about alternative epistemologies and cosmologies that we have kind of put blinders on. So research education is a fundamental part of a senior scholar's work. And I see that in my own trajectory, I see that this is not something that is encouraged. I see gatekeeping happening. These kind of ideas are not being allowed to come up. I can give you a final short example, and that is when I was headhunted to Jönköping, one of my first tasks there was to revamp the associate professor course. You probably know that in Sweden, a scholar, when they transit from assistant professor to a associate professor, a so-called docent position, they need to do this course. And I have had the privilege of running that course for all faculties across on campus. And that is one of my most enriching courses for me, because I get to meet scholars from across disciplines and I learn from their challenges and their workings. And 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, I was asked to redo that course. And I brought in decoloniality much more centrally, because now we see, for instance, in Denmark, we see scholarship coming up on higher education from decolonial lenses. So I revamped that. And that was a risk. But at that point, I had just turned 60. And I made up my mind that if I can't contribute, I know that decoloniality is not something we discuss in Swedish academia. But if I don't contribute now, who will contribute? And I can already see repercussions of having done that. So maybe it is too early in Sweden. And maybe we need to turn towards Denmark and turn towards Norway to be able to understand these changes that are taking place there, to be able to empower ourselves. So it is research education in a number of different ways that need challenging. And some of us need to stick our necks out and do that, because if this is not happening in Sweden, this is happening in so many other spaces in Europe. This is happening in Portugal, where you are. This is happening ever since Roads Must Fall, the movement in 2015 in South Africa. This has taken over the university world in the UK, where I still engage from time to time. We need to catch up in Sweden. And I am engaged in a new research school that I contributed to get money to my present university. And I feel that this is not happening. Even though in that particular research school, one of the compulsory courses for doctoral students was decoloniality and Southern perspectives. But, a course is not what is needed. It is our ways of thinking, our ways of engaging, our ways of understanding. Why are we doing research? For whom are we doing research? Who are we who are doing research? And for whom?
Right, because there is so many of us, if not most of us, may realize in the process of discovering our positionality that there are aspects of colonialism that are there, that we weren't aware of, and that were just a part of either our upbringing or the education that we received, right? So a single course or simply just seeking alternative ways is just the first step. Let's turn to language now and languaging. It's something that we have only briefly touched today. In your 2022 publication, Languaging and Decoloniality, Critical Perspectives from the Global South, you argue for a paradigm shift in how we view language. Why are languaging practices connected to colonial structures? And why is it important or essential to continue unpacking the way we communicate to address decoloniality? And also perhaps you could explain what is languaging.
Yeah, so I'm invested also in the field of social linguistics, applied linguistics, so the language sciences broadly understood, and have been writing. So my PhD from 1995, I realized much later, I think I was already professor then, that was the first PhD in the Nordic countries that looked at multilingualism. I didn't know that. I actually never worked with my doctoral data when I got assistant professorship in education in Örebro. So I moved from Linköping to Örebro. I already had a postdoc project that external funding, and that had shifted to deaf studies. So from gender, migration, and ethnicity, where I was looking at language, and bilingualism, multilingualism, and literacies, I moved to the bilingualism of deaf students and teachers and hearing teachers in deaf schools. And I had funding to do that. So because of that move, my own thesis work never was something, it was never something that I spoke about in my own teaching or in my own work. So as a professor, when I started applying for funding, I had a project called LISA 21, Languages and Identities in School Arenas in the 21st Century, from the Swedish Research Council. That is when I realized that my thesis was one of the first ones in the Nordic countries to look at multilingualism. And multilingualism was still not something that we were talking about in Swedish spaces. It was bilingualism, and it was, oh, bilingualism is very good, but then, we ourselves as scholars and we ourselves as teachers in school settings did not embody that, even though all are at least bilingual. There is a 3-language policy in Swedish schools, as you might probably know. So it was during the Limkul Research School years that I learned from my colleagues who were supervisors in that research school. They attended to my frustration that only one PhD student actually engaged with multilingualism, and that was my PhD student. She was looking at Finnish, Swedish school arenas with me and 2 fantastic co-supervisors who had Finnish in their repertoires. The other senior scholars told me, but when we don't do work with multilingualism, how can we supervise doctoral students who are tasked to work with multilingualism? That is when it struck me that, the paucity of understanding the normality of multilingualism. So the work on languaging then it goes beyond the rhetorics of bilingualism and multilingualism or plurilingualism as something good. We embody ourselves the many ways with words, and words not just as spoken words, but also words in terms of embodiment. I am looking at you on a screen. When you nod, it communicates something to me, right? So that is part of our languaging, even though at the moment we are primarily languaging in the named language English. I wouldn't break out and start signing with you. I wouldn't start speaking in Hindi with you. I would have asked you whether we could language as a verb in Swedish before our pod. Because human beings language in this way, that we fall into one another's ways with words in order to create meaning. If you constantly were a question mark on your face, I would stop and say, Anna, did I get my point across? Right. So those are dimensions of languaging, whether we do it in one named language or multiple named languages. Most human beings across the planet are so-called multilingual. Their normal languaging is picking up repertoires, and that includes embodiment, that includes different named languages, that includes pointing, that includes how human beings communicate. So languaging is communication in its more fundamental theoretical sense. So if one becomes acquainted with the work of the dialogical theoretical work of Per Linell, a Swedish social linguist, or the work of anthropologist Ruth Finnegan, when she retires, she writes a book called Where is Language? Note, she does this when she retires. Or if we become acquainted with the work of Roy Harris, who worked in Oxford and Cambridge, these Ivy universities, he was disliked tremendously because during his lifetime, when he was working before he retired, he was writing books like The Language Myth in the Western, in Western culture. Obviously, if you go against the grain of known knowledge, you are not going to be welcomed with open arms. European history is full of this. People have had to pay with their lives when they said the world is spherical and not flat, even though the empirical evidence is that the earth is flat, right? So these scholars start interrogating what is language, and that is because language has become reduced to grammar. I mean, I'm putting it very simply, but it is learning the system and not learning the communication. So I'll give you an anecdote. When I was doing my postdoc, my children were 5 and 10 years old. So they were with me, and then in the university I was with, they went to the school there, and this was a bilingual school. It was fantastic. It was a laboratory school. This is something very common in the US, that universities actually do their work in a particular school. And this school was on campus. I was given housing on campus, so we were living there. And my 5-year-old went to a preschool there, kindergarten, and this was bilingual. So he spoke oral English, because that was one of the languages in my home. And he, of course, spoke Swedish, but that I didn't take that. And then in his school, he had American Sign Language. He grew up knowing Swedish Sign Language. He's a hearing child. When we come back, his principal, who happened to be a former student of mine, contacts me and said, should we let him go and do his kindergarten again, because he must have forgotten all his Swedish? So I said, let him be, and you can see where he fits in. Not only, I mean, he carried on. He was in grade 1, which is 1 year younger to all the others, because he, of course, came back into his Swedish nest. Within 2 weeks, he had this local dialect back and everything. But my oldest son was failed in his English.
How did that happen?
Yeah, so that was the only time I have ever visited his school, just to find out what happened. Yeah, because then I saw that they gave him a list of Swedish words and a list of English words, and he was asked to translate. And this is the same thing that happened to the younger son, that, his English was not recognized because it was a translation. So this is what language then has become reduced. And of course, I'm giving you an anecdote, but through my research and the research that I have followed and supported of my postdocs and my doctoral students, I have seen the same thing happening with a bunch of other language constellations, that we are focused on the structures of language in order to learn. So if you are interested in learning, you need to step outside the classroom in order to understand, how do we learn? How do we become competent users of language? This thing that we call language, and that is languaging. So that is one aspect of it. The other is our languaging. How do we as scholars, and that is something that I have become more and more interested in, how do we language about issues like culture, issues like diversity, issues like identity, but also issues called language? What are the labels that we put? And here, fundamentally, we need to rethink, we need to re-envisage, we need to re-theorize. So one of my chapters in a volume on higher education actually starts with RE dot and goes on to talk about this need to rethink. And this builds on the work that, I've given you some references of scholars who, unfortunately, some of them at the end of their careers, make these, where is language? This is a very, very important question. How do we know where language is? And what is language in those settings that we call schools or we call teacher education? And these are troubling questions that become important from a decolonial gaze. But these are questions that most of us find very difficult to take, but we need to live with that discomfort. So languaging needs to be seen as these two things, something that is completely normal. And that is why I call, instead of saying multilingualism, I say that is normal languaging that human beings are capable of. And then we also need to look at our own languaging as scholars.
What does it also say about us or about the character of academia that we are unwilling or hesitant to ask this initiating questions, right, about the nature of language and the possible discomfort that this can throw our scholarship into? In several of your works, you discuss the notion of epistemic justice and epistemicide. What is epistemicide, and how does this concept influence your approach to research ethics?
So I will come back to an issue we have taken up earlier on, that if we acknowledge that European powers of the past colonized what we are now calling Southern territories and the global South, and then we need to understand that they not only appropriated the material, tangible resources and abused people's existence in those territories when they occupied those spaces. And we need to remind ourselves, it's not more than 75 years ago when this shift started taking place and the majority spaces of the world became independent, at least politically and administratively. We then need to take the lunge into that the epistemological landscape has also been colonized. And this is based on the imperialistic ideological foundations. So within higher educational settings across the globe, all of us have a Eurocentric education. So I am a product of Eurocentric education, not just when I was moving around in different southern territories because of my parents' work, but also when I was studying in the UK and in Sweden and in the US. So understanding that fundamental nature of a universalistic, mainstream, hegemonic education then feeds on to the idea that epistemologies, the multiversality of different knowledge regimes, have been suppressed at best and killed at worst. So this is what decoloniality, this is what understanding coloniality allows us to engage with. So then, if we have made this linkage, so it is this joining of the dots, then we start understanding epistemic justice in a very different way. So this is a fundamental idea within SWASP, that ethics is not just about getting institutional agreement to be able to conduct research. It is interrogating the universal nature of knowledge production that I am complicit in, have been, and if I have started recognizing that ethical dimension, then how can we go forward to change that? And I think our doctoral students are the future here. At least my doctoral students are the future here. A month ago, I think, or 3 weeks ago, we had the first conference on education and race. You know, race is a word that we are not allowed to use in Sweden. I am maybe one of 4 or 5 scholars who use it, and I am thankful to some of my more junior scholars who have educated me through their writings, and I have become empowered and have only recently started using this term. But it is my doctoral students who contribute to a conference like Education and Race, the first one. And it was not hybrid because this is something we are learning to language about. So epistemic justice is about living with discomfort because you are one of the few who is doing work on social justice from these ways of understanding justice. it is not about me doing something for you. It is actually through our collaboration. Even if you are a bachelor student, it is through that collaboration that I become aware of the need to adjust our teaching. I become aware of the complexities of lived lives. So epistemic justice is about understanding the partial nature of all knowledge production, understanding the need for multiversality. So there are scholars who talk about all social sciences and humanities and natural sciences as contributing to understanding what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. Irrespective of whether you are interested in the small thematic area A or B or C. So, Molifi Kete Asante, I think his name is, he talks in terms of being human being, something I feel very empowered with. So what does it mean to be a human being? He plays with that. And of course, he's a very, very influential decolonial scholar. But my point is that it is not because you are a decolonial scholar that you need to do this. This is reflexivity. This is, again, I'm coming back to the terms that we use. We are using them, but they seem to be rather hollow. So, epistemic justice means that we are constantly interrogating ourselves. We have acknowledged the partial nature of all knowledge production. We have acknowledged the fact that we are too universalistic, and we need to create universities that are multiversities.
On the notion of self-interrogation, you also highlight that digitalization brings global crises directly to our analog doorsteps, living rooms, and mobile devices, contributing to an acute sense of despair while challenging linear developmental narratives. Essentially, it makes us all active stakeholders in the global enterprise called Earth, right? So therefore, my final question is seeking advice, really. How can we leverage this access to our advantage to decolonize independently of institutional and individual agendas? What steps can we take to reduce our reliance on limited narratives that are being made available to us and to reflect more critically on the world?
A couple of things that I have learned through my own collaboration. So I don't know whether I will advise. It is more that this is what I have learned. One is, I mean, there was a phase in my career when I became worried with this concept that you just said, critical. You know, we have critical theory and our vocabularies, again, you know, they allow us to, having identified a problem with our theorizing, then we go to critical theory. But then now critical theory has lived such a long life and we are not seeing. So I'm not saying we should not, because I fundamentally mean that as a scholar, you cannot say we should not use. But sometimes refocusing allows us to then come back to those terms. So at that point, and I started talking about being curious. Instead of critical, be curious and be creative. So these are 3 C's, you know, and today I could talk of all 3 of them together. So if you are curious about the state of the world, you need to constantly ask yourself, how do I know what I know? Right? Digitalization means that anyone can, and you know, I think we are now in Web 5 or Web 6. A couple of years ago, I wrote a paper with a former doctoral student of mine, and we then wrote, you know, this was Web, which then became Web 1.0, and then Web 2.03, and now I think we must be in 6. Today, you and I can create content and say what we feel like. And there is no, in many non-moderated spaces, there is no one who checks that. So if you are not a scholar, and even if you are a scholar, how do you know what you know? And today, if any point in human history, we need to constantly ask ourselves. So when I am writing, when I am co-writing, I need to say, how do I know that it is not just Russia that has attacked another territory? What do I know about the historicity of that territory on the planet? Who am I to just send money? And for what am I doing? So these are bunches of questions. And of course, we have discussed the Israel-Palestina situation. Again, we need to ask ourselves, and this is what Sandhu Hira offers us. I feel very worried with what he has opened up, at least for me. The reason I shifted from the review to the article was because I realized I need to decolonize my mind. So this is an ongoing process. So in addition to being curious and creative in our own work, whatever that work is, I want us scholars to understand the privileged, and it's not just scholars, it's also students, to understand the privileged positions that we are in. I, as a senior professor, get paid to think. Of course, there are problems with that, but that is my work. And how am I thinking? How am I teaching this possibility of thinking to my students, to my collaborators? How am I learning from their thinking? It is not just within the sector of academia. A hopeful future is also to collaborate with other sectors. A couple of years ago, I was at the book fair in Gothenburg, where we had 15 minutes to talk about CCD. So I took a junior scholar who I was mentor for, and we discussed CCD. And then they were sending out at that time tweets on what is now X, on two things that each researcher pair took up about whatever topic they were talking. So ours was, here we have a professor who says that we need to learn from the learning and the knowledge creation of other sectors. And I remember on the train journey back from Gothenburg to Jönköping with my colleague, I was saying, so what was strange about that? I hadn't realized that this is something strange. I, as a professor, should hold on to my power of saying that this is the knowledge that you need to know. So in 2012, I started collaborating with the cultural sector in Sweden. And I continue to collaborate with a colleague whose name is Petra Wäckström, who has been chief of the National Touring Theatre, Riksteatern, and was the chief in Örebro Theatre, where I have been affiliated earlier on. That work has taught me much more than any other collaboration I have had, and I continue to write with her. So looking beyond multidisciplinarity, we need to also look at multi-sectorial work. Petra and I set up in 2016 a think tank called Do It. In English, it would be the Participation and Inclusion Think Tank, where we invite politicians, social workers, bureaucrats, athletes, people working in the civil society to come and educate us. Unless we do this, two things are going to happen. our writings as scholars are going to be read by our doctoral students and the odd pod owner like you, no one is going to be interested in what we are writing. Our ideas are never going to be discussed critically in the larger spaces of society. Some of us do that. So you might become a star professor who is invited to SVT and who's invited to a radio show regularly, or you might start writing regularly and popularly. But the point is, how can you maintain your positionality as a scholar and contribute to knowledge production and creation from a multiversal lens without engaging with other sectors where knowledge production is constantly taking place? So it is not we who have to educate them. We have to do this together. So those would be the ways in which one could also build hopeful futures. Those would be the ways in which, those are the ways in which I have learned that we need to work for going ahead. So I don't know whether this is advice, but this is at least important ideas worth coming back to. And I will go back to, this is part of multiversality. This is not multiversality only in the knowledge production within the sector of higher education and research. And we are seeing some of these changes taking place more radically. So we have European nation states that say, we are now not going to send in information for the world ranking lists. We have the DORA declaration, the declaration on research assessment that started off in 2012 and that has gained momentum, and new such initiatives have been launched where we don't just count how many papers a researcher publishes, but how are scholars engaging with societal issues of concern. And given that we have not been able to engage and make a dent, the time is ripe that we actually pay attention to these new initiatives and contribute. And I have had the privilege of being an evaluator for the European Science Foundation, for the EU, for a national research councils in Norway, in Latvia, in Greece, in the Netherlands, across time. And I see this as these changes taking place slowly. So possibly that is what keeps me going. But there is so much to change that I do feel overwhelmed. And you said that this was your last question. So I want to thank you for creating this space for me to be able to reflect myself on these issues that I have been writing on, because this is not something that I do. I just write.
You are very welcome, and I thank you for finding the time to meet with me today. This seems like a good moment to leave our listeners to their own devices. There was so much food for thought in that last answer you have provided. For more information on Sangeeta's work and publications, please refer to the links that will be published underneath this episode. And to you, Sangeeta, many, many thanks for being here today, and the best of luck with everything.